Okay, we're recording.
Welcome to the February 5th, 2025 Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. We will start with the first item on the agenda, which is the approval of the January 15th, 2025 Finance Subcommittee minutes. Can I get a motion for approval?
So moved.
Thank you. Second?
I'll second.
Okay, Carolyn, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Next item on the agenda is the approval of grant applications, which we have none. The one after that is acceptance of grants, which we have one. And you can see on the screen that Betsy pulled up. It is the FY 2025. Whoa, got small all of a sudden. Sorry.
Right. Let me
IDEA grant. Oh, where'd it go?
share a better one. 1 second.
Okay. Thank you. So the IDEA grant, which is for 2,339,000, and is it 946? Yes, $946. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Guillory to introduce the IDEA discussion.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. I'm going to recommend favorable action on the FY25 IDEA grant. This is one that is a large entitlement grant that we have through the federal government, through DESE as well. And it's one that's very much needed for many of the services that our students are deserving of. What I'm going to ask Dr. Givens to walk us through will be recommended, certainly the approval of the grant, but then there are recommendations or feedback that the working group has been, the cross-departmental working group has been going through to give some suggestions on modifications that we may need to make to the grant. In order to, number one, get greater return on some aspects of circuit breaker, but then also charge some items to the grant, and knowing that then we need to make anything that's not covered by the grant will then have to be covered by the operating aspect of it as well. And so, Dr. Givens, I'll pass the mic over to her to walk us through the fine details of such.
Thank you. Susan?
Sure. Betsy, if you can roll up to the next document there. So I'll start off with the first, orienting you. The first column is how the IDEA grant was presented in the FY25 spending plan. As part of the budget deliberation process, the school committee voted to launch the middle school Winthrop House with an understanding that the Winthrop House teachers would be funded through the IDEA grant. So that was added midstream through the process, and then ultimately the budget was approved by the school committee with the spending plan as you see it here. At the time, I believe, and rightly so, that there'd be more grant money coming from the federal government, and lo and behold, in the end, it was less than what we received in the current year. So in the first column again, about this time last year, late winter, early spring, when we went through the process, the first column represents what was included in the spending plan at that time. When the grant was written, and the documentation that is included in the packet here tonight writes the grant in a different way. And so the second column, or the middle column, represents how the grant was written. And as you can see, funding for some essential staff for the student services department were not included when the grant was written. And so this has caused an awful lot of strain financially on the school district. And so in early January, Dr. Guillory moved forward with a cross-departmental working group so that we could look at this grant and, you know, our deficit and try to come up with recommendations for what would be the best way to leverage some of these grants that we have and sort through, you know, what were essential services as we move forward through the year and what kinds of things might we be able to hold off on until a future time and place. So the third column then represents the recommendation for how the grant would be modified from the submission in order to maximize the use of this grant for this year and then moving forward from there. So I can walk through the various line items if that's helpful. Or
I
can
think it
pause
would
for a
be,
moment.
if
Okay.
you don't mind, yes.
Nope, not at all. So the idea is that, you know, there's a desire to obviously fund as many of the original teachers that were included in the grant as possible. So that was one of the, you know, kind of guiding factors as we contemplated, you know, how to modify the grant. As I've mentioned, we know that the school committee had approved the Winthrop House and at the time of the budget adoption, there was 3 professional staff members that were included in that. So that's what the 3 represents in the account titling. And then comma 1 means a paraprofessional was added for the Winthrop House. And so the 328,883 represents the total cost of the 3 teachers and the para that were actually hired for the Winthrop House. When the conversation took place during the budget process, the estimate was 246,000 or 250,000. We rounded up when we were having the dialogue about that. The grant was written for 191,000, but the actual cost based on the staff that were hired is 328. So that's why the recommendation is 328, because it matches the staff that were hired for the middle school Winthrop House. There were no new teachers included in the original budget for the grant. The submission included 3 new teachers. None of those teachers have been hired, and there is no proposals or documents that have come before me suggesting that we add any teachers this year. So as a result of that, you know, the recommendation of the group is to not add teachers if that's not, and then therefore we can fund teachers that were already in the grant. Paraprofessionals likewise were not included in the original grant, and other than the one up on the line where it says Winthrop House, it would be zeroing out that portion, again, freeing up money to go back to fund some of the teachers that were no longer funded under the current submission. And then under the summer school, in the original budget proposal,
Just
we
to
estimate-
clarify, Susan, you skipped
Sure.
secretary. Was
Oh.
that just intentional?
No.
Okay.
No. It's tired. No, secretary has been on the grant for as far back as I can see or I've looked. And so we would continue to support that expense being allocated out to the grant. And then summer school, the original was 450. The grant was then written for 518, but the cost of the extended school year program is 750. And so the recommendation is to include the full cost of the ESY program here for a couple of reasons. One, it makes it really visible. One of the challenges that we have seen over time is that costs of programs are split up into different buckets, and then sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle. And so we want to make sure when the new deputy comes on board that they they can have full view and sight of what the school, the ESY program costs and where it's funded from. Also, there is no MTRS contribution to summer program because it's considered additional comp, not base comp. And so there wouldn't be any additional costs associated with benefits under the grant. Proportionate share, this is, the private schools are get a portion, in Brookline, get a portion of the grant allocation, and that's called proportionate share. And so this number obviously is fixed and needs to be set aside for our private school schools in the community. And then originally we had allocated out $363,842 for contracted service. So we would remain at that dollar amount. And then out-of-district tuitions were included in the submission. However, if we pay for out-of-district tuitions from the grant, then those expenses are not eligible for circuit breaker reimbursement. And so it's our recommendation of the group not to include those here so that we can take advantage of the reimbursement through circuit breaker. Either way, we're going to have to pay whatever tuitions are, but at least this way we'd get some money coming back to us in the following year. The professional development dues and membership, that pays for the MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. So that initiative that has been funded through this grant for the last couple of years was included in the original plan and remains intact. And you know, it's a contract that we're actively working with. I can't think of the organization off the top of my head, but we're actively working with them to implement the MTSS model here. Under supplies, there was no money originally allocated. Under this submission from OSS, it included a new program called Goal Books. That is an IEP, a program that enables staff to write IEP goals that I think conform to the new IEP model that was implemented this year. And it also includes money for the online credit recovery at the high school, Linus, do you remember the name of that? Well, see,
You said Edgenuity.
Edgenuity, thank you. And so those two contracts are currently in place, even though one is new. The other one has been in place for a couple of years. And so we would recommend moving forward with that expenditure. The MTRS is a percentage of this teacher salary line. And so that's the 9% contribution there. And then under other expense, that included a couple of other memberships and smaller contracts, but those contracts have not, my understanding from the group is that those contracts have not been executed. And so reducing that line to zero to, again, maximize the amount of money available on the teacher line so that's kind of how this recommendation was put together. So if you adopt or approve the grant tonight, you know, the hope is that you would approve it with an understanding that the recommended grant budget allocation would be submitted through the budget modification process in GEMS. So that's where the recommendation came from, and those were the reasons why behind the recommendation that was made.
Thank you, Susan, for the details. Questions from the subcommittee? Go ahead, Sarah.
Will you remind me what the model is with this? Is this a program where students are in and out throughout the year? And do you have, if you don't have exact numbers of attendance, do you have sort of like a ballpark figure of how many kids are often in the program?
Are you referring to Winthrop House?
Yes, sorry, Winthrop House, yeah.
Okay, I can't answer that question. I don't know. Dr. Guillory, do you know what the enrollment over at Winthrop House is?
I believe it's 3 students right now, 2 or 3, if I recall. I know I met 2 of the students, but I think there may be a 3rd one.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Carolyn.
2 or 3 I must have missed.
This is at the middle school Winthrop program.
Oh, sorry. I'm
Yes.
sorry. My daughter was texting me from Target.
Do you have another question, Carolyn? I see your hand is up.
Yes, I do. Sarah, are you all set? I have a few just quick clarifications, Susan. Thank you for this clear information. Summer program is what we call ESY.
Yes.
Okay. And is this the total funding for ESY? And I know there was some discussion last year, I recall, about sort of parity of pay in this program. So I'm wondering whether these numbers are recommending pay for the teachers and administrators at the same level, or whether this is any change.
Great question. So the cost of the summer program, and it's just for the ESY component, and this is for salaries. I don't know what additional supplies and materials, if any, need to be purchased specific for that we don't already have on hand. So I don't have an answer for non-salary expenses. Maybe Diane has some insight on that, but the 750 is based on the current rates that the school committee approved last year for the program. There is a little escalation here from the current year cost simply because when the rates were approved at a per diem rate, next year's per diem rate is higher. Per diem is of course attached to the CBA. And so any increase in the CBA then gets reflected in the per diem rates for summer school. So it is higher, a little higher for next year for that reason, but it's based on the rates that were approved last year
Okay.
by the school committee.
Thanks. I have a couple more of this nature. On the MTSS, is this the total that the district is spending on MTSS, or is there another funding source for MTSS? And also, I'd love to just a quick, just like what is this PD? When you say this is funding MTSS, and I can't, what was the line?
Yeah, sorry.
Was it contracted service?
Yes, so it's for a contract with a New Teachers Center.
Okay.
And they're the organization that we partner with on this initiative.
So
Isn't it under the PD dues and membership, Susan?
Yes, and I don't know why it's
sorry.
recorded there, but that's,
It's PD dues and memberships.
yeah,
So this is for PD and membership with
Yeah.
New Teacher Center who are providing PD and to on MTSS. And
Mhm.
is this the only, are we also pulling money from any other place for New Teacher Center?
that's a great question. I don't know that I know the answer to that, however.
Okay.
I'm not aware of like
Is
another.
Jody
public-
here?
If Jody's
Jody
here,
is
she
here.
could answer. Oh, goody. Jody can chime in. She'll know the answer to that.
Because I thought we had something else with New Teacher Center, but I don't know if it's active anymore.
I don't either.
Linus, do you have the answer?
No, but I was about to call Jody.
Okay. Well, why don't we put a pin in that one and come back to it when
Yeah.
Jody's available?
Oh, okay. And then the secretary, that is a secretary for administering this grant for a department.
It is the secretary that works with the director of special education at the high school.
Okay. And that's a full-time position?
It is.
Okay. And then I also just wanted to clarify proportionate share. This is not, you're saying this is not having to do with our out-of-district students, but we pay. Can you explain that a little bit more, what that is?
For proportionate share, so the federal grant, all of our federal grants are allocated to each community. And within the community, you have some private schools, and those private schools are entitled to a portion of your grant, so they call it proportionate share. So it's their
So like
proportionate share of
we,
our grant.
like Beaver Country Day School,
I don't know which, maybe Diane might,
but private schools that are nothing to do with our out-of-district placements for
no,
within special education.
no.
Literally, and there's no, that's an obligation, no
It's an
getting around.
obligation, that's right.
Okay.
And there are specific schools, I just don't know them off the top of my head. I'd have to look back in the records too.
And then I hate to sound a little, but I just want to understand this completely. Supplies. So again, where this is a grant, and I'm guessing, I mean, is that supplies for OSS as a cost center, as an office?
It is for 2 online services. And one of those services is Goal, GOAL book, which is an online tool for writing IEP goals. And the other service, online tool, is for this what'd you call it?
Ingenuity.
Oh, good, Edgenuity. I was gonna say that and I thought, oh, I got that wrong. So it's for those 2 online tools.
Okay, sorry, you might have said that before. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Val.
Carolyn?
Thanks.
Oh.
Carolyn,
Jody, yeah, why don't you go ahead and answer the question, Jody, which was about whether we have other contracts with New Teacher Center beyond MTSS right now.
Right now, our only contract is with MTSS. It's for MTSS, which we're using our literacy program as a cornerstone for. So the work does carry over into the launch of our new K-5 literacy program.
Thank you.
Thanks. And my question actually was whether the 155,394 shown here is the totality of what we are paying New Teacher Center, or whether we are contracted with them for more money than that that's coming from someplace else.
That's the total sum of the contract with them.
Thank you.
You're
Val?
welcome.
hi. Sorry, Susan. I joined from an elevator and then lost service for a while. I just want to understand the teacher salary, the first line budget versus the submission, and why there's such a large discrepancy. Who were those? It looks like 12 on my phone. What positions did those folks hold that you budgeted, but I guess OSS didn't submit for? And is there a legal reason why they didn't, or?
I don't have any explanation for why they weren't included in the submission, but they are special education teachers, and it's the same teachers that were on the grant in FY24.
But our regular special education teachers who we have year over year.
Yes.
I think that's not permissible, but I will leave that to somebody else. Okay, thank you.
It is, and it's quite typical to use the same teachers year in and year out on your recurring grants.
Val, any more questions, or is your hand now going down? I'm going to assume that hand is going down. Susan, could you explain to us now that this is the recommendation that we're being asked to consider, what the impact is on the operating budget as a
Sure.
result?
Yeah, so what will move off of all the grants, and that's what we can, FY '24 is fully spent as well. So the operating budget would be picking up $1,263,781.
How do we, like, is that visible here? How do you come to that number based on what's shown on this chart? Is it visible?
It's not, no, it isn't visible there in that what was budgeted isn't necessarily the amount of money that we wind up paying. So in other words, if somebody moves a step or a column mid-year, then they would be paid at a higher amount. So in the staffing plan, the salaries might vary from what the budget is, which is true no matter what fund you're looking at. But when I look at the total costs of the summer school program that was charged to the '24 grant, but there's not sufficient money to pay for all of that. And I look at the combination of things that were pushed off of this grant between the two IDEA grants. The difference between what was budgeted and the amount of money that we will now need to pay is that 1.263 781.
And how much was how much has been charged to the '24 grant there is not funds for to the '24 grant? How much has the '24 grant overcharged right now?
Once we clean out any of the expenses that were from '25 that were parked in there until this grant was approved, once we clean that out, it was overspent by about 150,000.
Okay, so there's like a little over $1 million here that's being impacted plus the 150,000 from last
Yeah.
year. And so now what does that bring or maybe I'm jumping ahead to the Q2 report. So tell me if this
Sorry.
question is too soon, but what does this $1.2 million bring the deficit for this year to?
On the salary side, so this is just salaries, is 2,230,241, and that is in the quarterly report.
Okay.
Yep.
Stephen, we are not calling on non-committee members because of the clarification we got on open meeting law, and having non-subcommittee members. Thank you. So, are there any other questions from the subcommittee on the proposal in front of us that the superintendent is recommending for the the fiscal year '25 IDEA grant?
I do just want to clarify, and forgive me because this is first time around with this. So this has just come to us. I think what Susan is saying is that some of this is going to backfill 2024. And no, this is all being applied to 2025. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to make a motion for acceptance of the recommended revisions to the '25 IDEA grant. Do I have a second?
I will second it.
Okay, Val, how do you vote?
Abstain.
Carolyn?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. Thank you very much. Now we will proceed to the next item on the agenda, which I have now lost. I think it's position control report, or no, it's acceptance of grants. I mean, I'm sorry, gifts. Apologies. Thank you, Betsy.
Mhm.
So the next item on the agenda is acceptance of gifts. We have 4 gifts in front of us. The first is from Yaramir, is it Slama and Julie Green for $1,000 for Winthrop House. The second is from Brookline Community Foundation for the Whipple Fund, $31,400. The third is from an anonymous donor for $25 for the Queer Student Union, and the fourth is from Elizabeth Cook for $50 for the Outstanding Speaker series. So thank you to our donors for these gifts. And the Whipple Fund, of course, has quite an extensive history as well. These are all wonderful gifts. Thank you. Can I get a motion for acceptance?
I'll move it.
I have a second.
I'll second.
Sarah, how do you vote?
Yes.
Carolyn?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. Thank you. Next item is the position control report, which is minuscule. Sorry, Betsy, can you make that like 1,000 times bigger? So the report that we have I think the newest update is, can you make it a smidge smaller so we can see the columns on the right? Thank you.
Okay.
So you can see there are 3 for January that are OSS updates. And the other note I want to make is the Chief of Strategic Initiatives is paused for the moment. As you can see, there's a note there as well. Anything else, Susan, that you want to particularly draw our attention to before I open it up to questions from the committee, from the subcommittee?
Sure. One of the things that is a little different is that in the fund type, where before we said funding source TBD, again, some of the work of the working group is to pay for some of the cost overruns in the current year budget through special revenue fund balances. And so I just made note here that these where we would be targeting funding for these. Also, when putting together the second quarter report, these positions and funding for them was included or rolled up into the total salary cost. Again, it's not fully funded at this point, but this was our thinking, and I wanted to share with you that information.
Can I ask a question which I didn't get to ask in November, which was that it appears that a computer science teacher at the high school has been eliminated for 2 of the paraprofessional positions. Could you speak to that? Or was it a computer science teacher at Lincoln? I'm confused about,
At
and then
Lincoln.
it says ed tech, which ed tech is like not computer science necessarily.
Yeah.
So what was eliminated?
It was, I guess, the common term we use is ed tech specialist, educational technology specialist. But in the teacher's contract, they fall under this titling of computer science teacher. So when I use in the funding source, I'm referring to what it's called in the teacher's contract as opposed to what our common terminology is.
Can I jump in here for a second, Mariah?
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody was actually talking to me about this. Maybe a month or so ago at school committee, we had a wonderful presentation from Runkle about their book club or book presentations, and that was presented to us by that ed tech person and all of that work that she did with the students with their books and presenting what they were doing. Do you remember, Sarah, you were commenting on it? That's the position that
Jenny
was
Murphy, yeah.
eliminated at Lincoln. So they do not have that person right now.
Last year, we had a long discussion in the budget about, and we ultimately decided to retain the ed tech FTEs, if I'm recalling correctly. Linus, could you comment on the elimination of ed tech at Lincoln? And I thought, maybe I'm misrecalling, but I thought each one of them was assigned at 2 schools. Aren't they 0.5 at 2 schools? There's 4.0 ed tech, or am I misremembering? Or no, maybe the proposal was to go from 8 to 4 and have them be split. I can't
Yeah.
remember. Okay, so can you explain?
So from what I understand from this position is that it has been open for the majority of the year. And so the principal's recommendation at this point, given the students' need there, was to leverage that funding to get a much needed paraprofessional support for that particular student. I believe that's what transpired there.
Can I make a comment about that, which is that I guess I'll call on myself, which is that I'm confused about that because essentially, aren't we borrowing against next year's budget unless we're not planning on ever replacing that position? So don't we need, that might be a Band-Aid, which I'm not sure I agree with one way or the other, but I can understand if you have no intention or no expectation of filling it this year, you might do that for this year. But unless you have decided to permanently eliminate ed tech at Lincoln, that doesn't seem to be a solution.
Sorry,
I guess,
well,
Go ahead,
and
Carolyn.
this decision was made in November. That's pretty early in the school year. So was it that the school was asking for paras that they couldn't otherwise get? So they had to just use what they had?
That's the way I understand it, Carolyn.
I just do want to make a point of clarification. The students on IEP, so those two paras were requested without a funding source in November. The principal made a recommendation just before Christmas to eliminate this ETF position to fund those two because there was not a previous, there wasn't a funding source previously. So I just want to clarify.
But I don't understand that because if it comes out of the student IEP, I'm not sure why we're borrowing against a general education position for a student IEP need. And I agree with Carolyn that it's relatively early in the year to decide. I mean, I don't know if it's early in the year, but it seems relatively early in the year to decide we're not going to fill the ed tech position, especially given, the school committee committed to retaining ed tech last year. So I guess I would appreciate if we can revisit this decision and not questioning the principal looking to problem solve. I understand the need to problem solve, but to me, those are two different things that we are borrowing against, and I don't understand that. I mean, if an IEP need is an IEP need, but removing the ed tech teacher does not seem to tie to that mandated service.
I'm not, all I can offer for food for thought is that since the salaries are overspent, just like when non-salary accounts are overspent, if there's no money available in the OSS budget, then the money has to come outside of the OSS budget to pay for it. That's why last year, if you remember, when we had a spending freeze on, we had to freeze everybody else's spending, but we still had to continue to pay for the OSS services. And so that factor, I think, plays into how are we going to get the paras there when there isn't a funding source within the OSS domain to pay for it.
And I'm just not sure. I hear what you're saying, but I'm just not sure why Brian was asked to, or Principal Denizio was asked to look within his own budget to identify the funding source. To me, this is a district IEP driven need. And if a position needed to be freezing, I'm not sure why it has to come out of his building. Sarah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, different points. I was about to say the same thing that's been said there. So I think everything's been covered. I just want to ask a second time, is the word eliminate truly eliminate? Because next year we'll probably have to assess how many professionals we need. And I would hope that Lincoln would be able to have an ed tech if they're able to hire starting in September, and it's not truly an eliminate. Is that the case?
Linus?
I'm sorry, Sarah, will you ask that question again?
So we have a couple of big issues here. Our first issue is that we are going to be adding paraprofessionals throughout the year, and we need to have a little bit of discretion in figuring out the budgeting for that. So I accept that that's completely an issue that has to be addressed. Given that, when we have a principal make a decision to reallocate the money that could be spent on an ed tech person to paraprofessionals, I would hope that that doesn't mean that we're eliminating that position. I would hope that in the future, Lincoln gets to hire for an ed tech person, and we're going to find somewhere else to fund the paraprofessionals. Is that the right assumption?
Can I almost reframe your question a little
Yeah,
bit,
that'd be
Sarah?
perfect. Thank you.
I'm going to ask it a little bit differently. In the budget next year, which we haven't quite seen yet, but I know is coming, is there a line for an ed tech specialist at Lincoln? And is there also funding for these one-to-one paraprofessionals?
I would have to look back at their chart. Susan, how does that roll up?
There is no ed tech position currently in the budget proposal for FY '26 at this time
At Lincoln or at all?
at Lincoln.
Okay. I think we probably need to park this conversation for the budget that is coming next week, but I will register my concern with that in advance. Carolyn, do you have anything to add to that particular?
No, I have
Right.
a different question.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. So just kind of big picture and putting all of our challenges together. So this position control report is always really helpful and interesting. Susan, at one of the meetings last week, maybe it was the TSP, you used the term soft freeze. So generally speaking, whether it might not apply here, so separately, I'm interested in what that means, but in terms of dealing with our current challenges, what can we expect to see going forward in terms of new positions? Is it safe to assume would only be paras that are called for in IEPs? I mean, not.
I think you've asked two questions, but maybe it's just the way that I process. So I think the first question is, what is a soft freeze? What do we mean?
Or I guess I'm asking, are we instating a hiring freeze of some sort? I don't know the right terms.
Yeah.
Such that we'll only see paras here as needed.
So a couple of things. When over the last month, I have met with all of the special education directors, budget managers in general, and we've gone through the staffing roster in great detail for the current year and in preparation for next year, to make sure that we're all clear about what we need to close the remainder of the year. And so these paraprofessionals are believed by principals and special education directors who work with those principals that these are in fact essential. So when we look at the quarterly report on the salary side, I've included that in there. We also have released money for stipends and or other positions that we won't be filling for the rest of the year. But we have yet to actually institute a hiring freeze, which based on the information I've shared with you tonight, I think, for any positions that we can plausibly get through the year without filling, that would be a good strategy to employ to close the gap. On the spending freeze side, that's looking at non-salary items. And so what we had asked, and this again came out of our working group, was, what kinds of things can we do? And in order to be able to make sure that we're providing the programming for all students for the remainder of the year, at least staying as true to our core programming as we can, and then having money available to shift over to OSS in order to help pay for the deficit that has been accruing in those areas. And so what we asked is that all staff submit purchase orders for any of those services and or supplies that they will need between now and the end of the year by the 28th of January. And Diane and her team are going through those and processing those. It's not available on this report tonight, in order to be able to see how much money in the non-salary accounts will be available to help offset some of the deficits that we have growing this year. So soft freeze just means that We're asking people to put all their POs in right now so that we can see if there's an emergency. Once we see what that is, we'll probably set aside a certain amount of that for emergency situations, right? But then identify how much of it can then be moved over into the OSS office so that bills can be paid over there.
Okay, I guess I don't, it does, that's helpful separately, thanks. I guess it's just not entirely clear to me. Like how we are controlling spending if other than something like para is associated with an IEP, how we could contemplate adding, I don't know, because I don't know, but sort of other kinds of new positions. And does this, if there was something to come up, say in HR, like the last couple of years, there were some new positions hired, would those show up here? Or is this only school-based, or where would sort of central admin or other admin show up? Would those show up here? Were you to be contemplating them?
Well, this is for new positions that were added
Okay,
after the budget was approved. So
okay,
any positions approved in the budget wouldn't show up on this report. These are positions that were added
Okay.
after that. And then how therefore are they funded? And in order for us to issue a new PCN number, there has to be a
okay.
funding source. And so that's what
So,
this. report is.
okay, perfect. That helps me understand. And so if there are positions that are funded but open, they still might, at this point, theoretically, we are filling positions. And again, I'm to my mind, powers associated with IEPs or other IEP services are separate and obligatory. So technically, open positions are still being filled.
Not all of them, as I was trying to say, like, we'll give the example of the chief of strategic initiatives.
Yeah,
That is not moving forward. And we aren't currently filling the director of data and information systems because of the situation we find ourselves in.
okay, thanks,
So,
Susan. That's
yeah.
helpful. I don't want to take more time. That you've given me a better understanding of
Yeah.
this. Thank you.
Susan, back in September, there was 2 paraprofessionals there that are saying that they would be funded out of IDEA. Given what we've discussed earlier today, are those 2 paraprofessionals still on IDEA?
No, that's part of what would move back off of IDEA.
Okay.
At the time, again, we didn't have the grant, right? The grant, I didn't have any detail on the grant back then. I didn't get any detail on the IDEA grant until December. So,
So for our next report, that funding source will be
we'll have to
will be
shift it.
modified. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions from the subcommittee on this? Okay, thank you, Susan. This is really helpful. I say that every single month because it gives us some insight into things that are going on that are really helpful to understand. Next item on the agenda is, are we at Q2 report? Sorry, I'm lost.
That's right. And I think
Okay.
Diane's going to share it directly.
Okay. Diane, I don't know if you're talking, but you're on mute, FYI.
All right, can you see the report with the bands?
We can't read it. We can visibly see it, but it's way too small for us.
Small, all right, let's make it bigger.
I think in the bottom right of your screen, there's a plus magnifying glass. Yeah, that
Big enough or bigger?
bigger.
Say when.
Keep going. There, maybe a little smaller if you can, or at least scooch it over a little bit so it's centered on the screen. That's good, I think. Thank you. Does everyone agree? Carolyn, Sarah, can you see that too? And Val? Okay. Thank you, Diane. Go ahead.
Yep, there is a revision to the end of this that I sent out just as this meeting was starting. So I apologize for that. What you're seeing on the screen is at the end slightly different. But here we see, this is the second quarter, so this was in early January. And you see the salary and expenses broken out by the major cost centers. So the superintendent, and we do not have salary projections by cost center because it wasn't possible to reconcile them at that level of granularity at that time. So these are the expenses and where we're projecting. So we have the superintendent, administration and finance, educational equity, and student services. And you can see flagging right here, this is what we were seeing in December already about the deficit that was happening on the student services side. The reason this deficit is as high as it is because some of the student services expenses reside in the student services office and other student services expenses reside out in the school. Student services expenses are rolled up. There's two sets of expenses for the general fund budget in the schools. There's OSS expenses and then there's general education expenses, and they're separate. So OSS's expenses ran out in December and everything else did not. But because of the way it's distributed throughout the schools, the office shows a bigger deficit, but the system doesn't allow them to continue into deficit across the district. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions on that point?
I did not follow that.
Okay, it's kind of high nerd accounting there. So basically, if you can think about OSS as a big bucket, and there's pieces of it in each school place, and also in the OSS office, and also in BEEP. Thinking of BEEP as another school. As a big bucket, they're capped by their budget, and they can't go over it by the munis system won't let them expend. This is not salary, it's just expenditures. Will not let them go past that total amount. But as you see in the student services office, they're overexpended because they have balances in other places.
But where are those other places, Diane? I'm confused
Each
by
of the
that.
schools, there's OSS expenses allocated to each of the schools.
So have you moved funding that is technically allocated to a school into OSS?
It's all in a big OSS bucket. The expenses live at the school under an OSS subcode.
I see.
So like OT expenses at Runkle or something like that. We know it's OSS, but we know it happens at the Runkle.
I see.
So globally, they're all OSS and the balance all comes together, but Runkle may have money, OSS Central may not. All together is what matters. So that's why you see a large deficit here, but you see the others by school, which includes both, sorry about that, which includes both OSS and non-OSS at the school level.
So are you double counting them? Like is the Runkle OT expense?
No,
Okay.
no, I'm not double counting them.
So that when we get to Runkle, those will be
Part of
Runkle
the-
or any school netted out of the OSS expenses.
Yes, you're only, when you look at student services office, you're only seeing a portion of their budget. Other pieces of their budget reside at the school level.
Oh, I see. I thought you had pulled them in here. Okay. Thank you.
No, I wanted to make that clear. Because it is set up for them not to run into deficit.
So how have they run into deficit?
They haven't.
But then why is it showing it's negative?
That's what I'm explaining. They have surpluses in some of the school budgets.
So my understanding is that the way roll-up codes work is there's, so OSS has a roll-up code that is OSS district-wide. And so in the OSS district budget, which is what you're seeing here, it's in deficit. Because it's in deficit, they cannot spend OSS money at the school level. Because the roll-up code is for all of OSS expenses. So that's why, otherwise, if the roll-up code was by this specific, this would have stopped spending in OSS for out-of-district placements and such earlier in the year. Am I explaining that right, Diane?
Not exactly.
Okay. That's my understanding about how that works.
So
We
the
think-
system knows that there's a deficit
The
central.
system knows when OSS is out of money, regardless of where it's budgeted.
Yeah. So,
And
so
so-
it's like,
It's a lockout,
it's
basically.
not, yep, understood. Yep. I'm thinking of like the ATM machine. And I'm then being
It's
like,
effectively
why
how it
can't I get my money?
So this is as of January 9th.
Correct.
So has this been corrected? I guess my question
There's
is, what are
no-
the implications for student services provision if they're in a lockout situation?
What we've been doing since then is they've been going back through their purchase orders, through their encumbrances, to see what they can reduce, to see what they can eliminate, to see if there was any duplication. And they've done that, and they've been able to encumber others and pay other invoices. They've been able to reduce some of their liability and pay some of their stuff. So they basically had to go back through what they had encumbered and check it very carefully.
So are you saying that although we just said this was a lockout situation, currently everything is proceeding as it needs to in Office of Student Services?
Not entirely. We still need to transfer, we still need to complete our work to figure out how much money we can take from the general fund to move over to OSS so they can continue to pay. They're paying themselves current, but to complete the fiscal year, we're going to need to move money over. We also
Okay,
need to
but
do
through the
IDP.
current time, services are proceeding and you're doing the work to finish out the year based on
Yes.
projections. Thank you.
Yes.
And we
I'm sorry to make that more confusing than it needed to be. I'm gonna think of a better way to explain it next time. Okay, teaching and learning. Beep. And then Baker, Driscoll, Hayes, Lawrence, Lincoln, Pierce, Ridley, Runkle, the high school. And here's all in, which is, I think, the more interesting view.
Is it
So this-
accurate? Is it accurate to say, Diane, that because of the soft freeze work that Susan described earlier, that a lot of the non-encumbered expense, i.e. that 2.168 million, may be reallocated to other areas?
And that will certainly be a lower number. How much lower, I won't know until we're done churning through all of those requisitions and we can rerun reports.
But essentially, yes, once you finish, once people encumber, then those funds will be reallocated for other purposes.
Yes. But it won't be 2 million, it'll be lower than that.
Understood.
So we've plugged in Susan's projection for the salary overage, and this is Susan's table down here. This is where the change in the phrasing was from when we sent this out earlier. So this has been rephrased, and I think Betsy will send out a revised copy. This was
So
our
Can I just
original,
ask one clarification? So the 66.863, you didn't have that broken out by building, but you have that as an overall fund. So that's why you can plug it in here, but not the subtables.
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
So our budget, 18,431, 394. Our salary expense, general fund overage was projected at just under $1 million, with bringing our current FY25 salary total to 19,397,848. With the grant adjustment that Susan was talking about earlier, as we went through the IDEA grant, that's another 1.23263,781, bringing our total salary need for FY25 to 120,661,629, making our total salary deficit as known as of right now, as of January, as 2,230,235.
So that 2,230,235 is the difference between,
It's the difference between the FY25
Yep.
appropriation for salaries.
And the 12661, et cetera.
You got it.
Okay, I didn't do the math. Thank you. And thank you for taking out the word deficit. That
Yeah.
confused. I mean, I figured it out, but.
Sorry,
Okay.
so what does GF stand for?
General fund.
I see. So the 966 was the 750K of the stipend adjustments from before, plus the paras we had discussed, the 4 paras we had discussed last month.
Right, and the breakage that was released.
Okay.
Right, so when we looked at it in the first quarter, it was like maybe 1.1 million or something in total between that, and 750 was associated with extra comp. And then the other portion of that was what we call breakage. And breakage has, we've realized some breakage since the last quarterly report because we haven't filled those positions. So, so that improved, but then I added in the 4 paras. So that's kind of how that nets out.
Okay.
Sorry,
you-
Mariah, was
Go ahead.
the stipend, was that from the first? Are we going back to when did we talk about stipends?
Stipends were discussed in November. I
Okay.
don't know if you recall back in even the prior fiscal year, Diane and Susan had been doing a lot of work to understand the discrepancy between the budgeted stipends and the actual total amount of stipends.
Okay,
And then that work continued through the fiscal year. That was an unknown quantity at the end of the fiscal year, continued towards this fiscal year. And in November, we got a detailed breakdown and the gap between true stipends and budgeted stipends was 750,000, which we're now carrying in the budget.
okay, thank you. And you sent me that the other day.
Mhm.
So the 966, 454, is that 750 and change plus?
Some of the other positions that we've talked about in the position control
Okay,
report.
fine.
Yeah, the
Thank you.
plus, yeah.
I'm glad I didn't miss something about stipends in the beginning of this conversation.
Now, I just want to add that with spending freeze, and if we, continue with not hiring, staff between now and the end of the year, then I'll release, the need to hold on to any additional money that will improve this situation on our salary side. So that's why,
So-
that's where it would be reflected when you have a spending freeze. So it would shrink the amount of money that we need. We wouldn't need then 120, 661, 629. It would be an amount less than that.
So the budget balance as of, I guess I'm trying to interpret what's our budget balance projected. I'm trying to merge the salary deficit information at the bottom with the table at the top and trying to understand where that leaves us.
I would
Like-
say almost break even, but we know that we're not.
You're saying the salaries are 2.2 in deficit, however, the expenses are 2.1 less whatever else you pick up. So we're
but
talking
this
about
isn't- those encumbrance aren't showing a spending projection to the end of the year.
which encumbrances, sorry.
The encumbrance column right here.
Yeah, the expense, which you already said earlier was going to be increased some and the 2.168 would be reduced some. Okay. So we're talking about TBD, but hopefully in the ballpark of less than $1 million in deficit.
I wouldn't put a pin in that yet.
Okay.
Overall or just for salary? Overall, right?
I wouldn't put a pin in that number yet.
Okay.
Until we see what's come in for encumbrances, until we see what we need in OSS, I wouldn't hazard a guess yet.
Okay.
Okay.
And, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
You might have said this along the way here. Expenses, I mean, are we talking again about field trips? Or are we talking about paper?
We're talking about everything. And believe me, after last year's freeze caught people unprepared, they are much better prepared this year and they've been encumbering things early and often. So
Is it things like intramural sports at the middle school level?
well, that's more on the salary side.
Okay, because that's a stipend.
Correct.
So right now, in this projection, it includes running spring intramurals, but if we don't run spring intramurals, then this number, the deficit's smaller. So anything we don't do that costs money obviously makes the deficit smaller. But included in the 120 is spring intramurals, the 4 paras, all of the extra comp that we're going to have to pay out, and the grant adjustments. If, based on, approving the IDEA grant as you did this evening.
Other questions from the subcommittee? So going forward from here, at our Q1 report, Susan, you were going to be providing an update on the plan to close the gap. Now we're at Q2. And I guess my question is, what's the plan from here to, will we get a report next month or do we have to wait for Q3? What's our timing look like?
Yes. So, the plan is.
I shouldn't even say next month because our next meeting's in 2 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks, but
is?
anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So once Diane is able to process the requisitions that have come in, we'll have a better sense of how much money is available in the non-salary lines. So part of the way that we're going to close the gap is by transferring money out of there to cover the deficits in other areas. So that's one. 2, we're going to look, once we get the FY26 budget launched and out to you, then the working group is going to be focused on 2 things. One, refining how we're closing the gap this year, as well as, working through the implications of making some of the budgetary reductions that will need to take place during this budget deliberation cycle. So in the next several weeks, we will be able to give you more information on that. But in essence, we do have some balances in our special revenue funds, 2 of them in particular, that we will likely have to tap in order to get through this year. Again, it's one-time money, and it's not going to help the structural nature of the expenditure shortfall this year, but it will at least be able to get us through the year.
You got quiet all of a sudden, Susan.
Oh.
There you go. You're back.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, so that's where we're at with that.
Okay. Go ahead, Sarah. Or no, maybe that's not a hand up. That's a, okay. Other questions? Go ahead, Carolyn.
Going back to Diane's explanation about OSS funds and how they are distributed throughout schools and sort of this situation where what should be the control so that that doesn't happen, so that people at the school level know whether there are funds that available to them when they are, I guess, calling in whatever they need to spend money on.
The funds at the schools aren't commingled. They're segregated. The principals don't have access to OSS funds, and the OSS doesn't have access to the principal's funds. So they reside in the school locations. So
Okay,
show you the reports by location. You
I
see them
see.
commingled, but they're not commingled.
Okay,
So if you wanted to see the fiscal picture of what's being spent in a building, you need both, because one without the other doesn't show you what's the activity in the building. You need both to represent the building. But you don't cross the streams like Ghostbusters. They're separate. It's not the principal who's buying things for OSS. It's the OSS coordinators and the OSS office that's using their funds to buy things that are needed for OSS.
Okay, I think I understand, thanks. And then also just as far as expenses, I'm trying to get sort of a picture of what between now and June 31st looks like altogether in terms of anticipated encumbrances. And I guess I'm trying to understand what all is wrapped up in this expense. I know I asked about this before, so I'm picturing sort of school level. And then if we go into sort of the district level, like is there PD that has to be put on hold that's, considered somehow, I suppose there must be some PD that's higher priority than other, I don't know. There was in OEE, there had been an equity audit consultant had been in the budget. Has that been encumbered or is that going to be on hold? Things like that.
Can you pull
I-
the thing back up, Diane? Because that's a
Sure.
good question, Carolyn, because I noticed that they only had encumbered like, I thought like $1,000 in the OEE budget. So,
Yeah, no,
but that was as of January 9th, which is now almost, it's at like 3 or 4 weeks old at this, 4 weeks old.
So the OEE contract for the equity audit will be in the
is,
next report. I
it
think
is encumbered, it's not yet released because the contract is not yet completed.
Can you scroll to that page just so we can look at it?
It won't show up in this report because this report.
No, I
was-
understand. It'll show that it's not there,
So
but
how
that way.
much is that?
it's 103,500.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I have to just say my reaction to that is how could we be doing that? Or and things like that that are not essential for educating our students on a day-to-day basis in classrooms right now. And is 100 what was budgeted? I thought it was 60. I think we need, like, that needs an explanation, and sort of everything in that level needs an explanation. If there's
Linus, can we,
what are we spending money on and not spending money on between now and the end of the year, or at least right now, when we have this kind of deficit, other than teachers in classrooms?
Linus, can you respond to that?
Sure. I just want to make sure that the equity audit piece, was that funded through one of the title grants?
No,
That wasn't. Okay.
no.
So so yeah, I was thinking that was on the title grant aspect of it. So once we get these sort of the roll up of what was requested, I think we can dig deeper into what people believe that they need to have for the remainder of the year, as well as then direct those types of things over to continue paying our OSS obligations as well. And the other part is I'm wanting to make sure, because I'm continuing to struggle with sort of these older invoices that are still coming in from last year, to make sure we have a full accounting of what our true OSS needs are, recognizing that they're also they've been increasing for this year as well. But I think that's a very fair question, Carolyn, to say then how these items that are not student facing directly, do we need to continue with those? And given that the contract hasn't been signed, this would be the opportunity to get in front of that before we have an obligation there.
I do think it would be helpful, per Carolyn's point, and I'll call on you in just 1 second, Val, just to, if there is a process that you're going to be doing to sort of reevaluate, or I'll say not just accept at face value what people have decided they want to encumber for the year. So, or maybe Linus, you can talk about that, or Susan, like even though they've encumbered things, are you also scrutinizing them to ensure you agree with their necessariness?
Yeah, so once that information's gathered, I'll ask to see what those are and meet with those budget managers to verify that aspect of it as well. Because again, I think the broader concern is how big is the bread box right now that's unseen to us. And so I just want to make sure that we aren't partially solving a problem, but we're actually having enough bandwidth to cover it in totality.
Thank you. Val?
Thank you. Diane, I just want to follow up on something you said earlier. You said that special education costs are captured in both the OSS line, but also in the schools.
Yes.
So do you have, and maybe you said this and I just missed it, do you have insight into the total OSS spend on a monthly basis at OAF? So between all those cost centers, or?
I can roll the expenses all together and look at it that way. I don't usually look at it on a monthly basis. I generally look at it, in December when the balance was getting low, I was looking at it every couple of days. Yeah, I can see it that way. I roll it all together to look at it, or I roll it apart. But really, I mean, it's the whole bottom line. That's the important thing. One of the biggest things that my concerns are is, have we encumbered enough for all of our out-of-district tuition costs? Have we encumbered enough for our transportation costs? Those are the hugest ticket items, and we have to get those encumbered right away. I think we did a good job with getting those on the books right away this year. I was very happy about that. In fact, when they went back through them, they found some duplication, and I'm always much happier to hear we had duplication than under encumbering. But the next part of it is the contracts, the out of district providers, and getting those all on the books continues to be more challenging. We're making good progress. We've made a lot of progress in the last month, but until we have them all on the books, I won't really rest easy.
And so it's challenging for that at this point in February. Why? What's the biggest barrier to getting those in the books?
Having the contracts properly done before the services start being delivered.
Okay. But we had these contracts, I assume, in July?
We did not.
Okay. I'm a little confused about that. We didn't have any of the contracts out for these services in July?
No. I made a list from last year's big contract providers and met with Lisa before I went on vacation in July and said it would be really good if we could get these contracts going and get them all moving quickly through the summer so they could all be in place before school started, but it didn't happen.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions from the subcommittee on the Q2 report?
I would just say this is super helpful. Thank you, and I appreciate the explanation. I'll just sort of add that if going forward, it can also pull in some of those sort of district level things that are anticipated for the rest of the year. That would help round it out even more. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't understand what you mean,
I
Carolyn.
was getting ready to ask
Okay.
clarification too.
That's okay. Like the thing I asked about.
Excuse me. You mean like once they figured out which things, once Linus reviews the things he agrees are absolutely necessary, then we would see an updated report with the updated encumbrances, you're saying?
In a manner of speaking, except that I feel like in a crisis, it would surprise me if decisions are made to be spending major amounts of money on things that are not student-facing classroom.
Sure, but that would still be an updated list, even if it might be shorter than it originally was, right?
I guess I would say then I would object, and I would be troubled if the same austerity that we're seeing here is not applied throughout. I hope that it will be. And sort of conversation about that will be helpful.
Thank you.
If $100,000 contract is encumbered between now and the next time, and then we're told about it, that doesn't do us much good financially.
Well, I think that I'm not going to speak specifically about that contract, but I think that speaking specifically about that contract, there may be very good reasons and educational reasons to pursue things, and there may be a difference of opinion on school committee about what things advance our educational mission. And so I think that I am going to be interested to hear from Linus which things he determines to be necessary and not necessary, so we can have that conversation. But I just want to put my voice out there of saying it's not predetermined to me that the equity audit isn't required. I just think we need to have that conversation about if there's going to be big changes that also impact our strategic plan, because a lot of what is in the budget is tied to the strategic plan and milestones and outcomes. So if we understand that there's going to be impacts on things we're doing, I do think we should have that conversation about where we see the plan being modified by modifications to the budget. That would be my opinion on it. Okay. Thank you, Diane, if you don't mind taking that down. The next items on the agenda is FY26 budget development updates, and then discussion of strategies to increase revenues and contain costs. Discussion of strategies to increase revenues and contain costs. My understanding it is not ready for today, although we had hoped it would be, and that will be coming by our next finance committee meeting. Linus, Susan, is that correct? Linus?
I got distracted with the DPW message, so.
Oh, sorry. I haven't gotten it yet. So, the question was the discussion of strategies to increase revenues and contain costs. That will be coming for our next subcommittee meeting, correct?
Yes, that
Okay.
should. And by that you mean what are we going to be looking at for the FY26 budget to fit
Correct.
inside the pants that we've been given?
Yes, exactly. And then, or I'll even frame it differently. How close can we get to fitting inside the pants we've been given? I think we need, if we can't, we need to talk about that as well, but I want us to understand what the proposal is and how far it gets us. So we're not going to talk about that today. And then there is the item before that is FY26 budget development updates. And I wonder, Susan, if you could just give a brief update if there's any adjustment to the timing of budget delivery or anything else that the committee might want to know about when they can see, when you're anticipating they'll see the FY26 initial budget request.
That's now my time and effort will shift back to doing that, but I had to pause that in order to get prepared for tonight's meeting. So we're down to finishing up the narratives and having those written. But the bulk of the work has been done. We just have to pull the last few pieces together. So I'll be here first thing early in the morning to continue on with the work with that. So our goal is to get that out to you tomorrow.
Thank you. That's a tremendous amount of work for you and all the other people who are contributing to that effort. So thank you for that. Any last questions or comments from the subcommittee before we adjourn for tonight? Or from you, Dr. Guillory?
No, thank you all for your engagement around this budget situation that we're in. We are committed to figuring all aspects of this out to ensure that we're not in this type of space again, but also more importantly, that we are building a budget and having that information contained early on within the budget so that we understand exactly what our needs are for our students as well as our staff. And so as we've been shifting from a centralized model to a site-based model, we found, as Susan's talked about and Diane as well, areas that were missed or weren't encumbered, or weren't included. And so we are getting stronger with our budget build. And as we're going through these types of changes, is recognizing that this work is complicated, especially in a system where that model hasn't been the standard as such. And so we appreciate your commitment, as well as your questions and pushing us to ensure that we have the strongest financial plan that matches and exceeds our educational plan.
Thank you. Okay, everybody, have a good night, and we have school committee tomorrow? We do, right? Okay. See you
Yes.
tomorrow.
Yes.
Goodbye, everybody.